You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle or me at leadersandlegends.net. And as always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is distinguished author David M. Rubenstein. He is the best-selling author of The American Story and How to Lead. He is co-founder and co-chairman of the Carlyle Group and CEO of Major League Baseball's Baltimore Orioles, who beat my Reds in 1970, 4-1, unfortunately. Mr. Rubenstein is chairman of the board of trustees of the John F. Kennedy Center for Performing Arts and the Council on Foreign Relations. My friend Ken Edelman has come on a few times. I don't know if Ken.
I do know Ken,
Edelman.
Yes.
He has written a new book and has set the bar high for everyone with whom he conducts an interview. The book is called The Highest Calling: Conversations on the American Presidency. It is out now, available on Amazon or your favorite bookseller. It is a series of interviews with distinguished historians on and of the American presidency. Mr. Rubenstein, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. My pleasure.
You talk to people whose names are well known, that's for sure. And I'm very grateful the Leaders and Legends podcast has also talked to a couple of people whom you have, and that is Ted Widmer, who wrote the brilliant book Lincoln on the Verge. And we also had a great conversation with Jeffrey Frank concerning his book on Harry Truman. You have several authors in here, including Ron Chernow, Gordon Wood, the brilliant Gordon Wood, Susan Eisenhower, Richard Norton Smith. How did you come to choose certain authors and certain presidents to chronicle in your book?
Let me give you the dirty secret of how I do it. I have a number of programs. I have a program where I interview a great historian once a month in front of members of Congress. It's a program I started 10 years ago to educate members of Congress about American history. And it's bipartisan, nonpartisan. I do it once a month. And so some of those interviews occurred there. I have another program at the 92nd Street Y where I interview people. And then I have another program at the New York Historical Society where I interview people. I have taken some of the best of those interviews relating to presidents, and then I added to them ones where I thought there were gaps where I wanted to have an interview about a certain president if I hadn't done it yet. And then I also have interviewed presidents themselves. So the book includes an interview with President Clinton, an interview with President Biden, an interview with President Trump, an interview with as well with President George W. Bush.
Do the members of Congress, how do they react to your lectures, to your interests, to your questions?
Members of Congress like it because I do it at the Library of Congress, which they can come to from their offices going underground, so it's difficult to get to. I have a dinner, so I have a nice dinner for them before, and I ask them to sit with people from the opposite party in the opposite house, which they rarely get to do, and there's no press there to see what they're doing, so they feel free to talk with people in the opposite party and not be afraid of being criticized. And also, I tend to have pretty good historians that are working with the Library of Congress to pick them. And I think members of Congress like it. We've been doing it for 10 years now.
Have you ever had, you mentioned the New York Historical Society, and this is a guess, so please forgive me. Harold Holzer, have you brought him on in
Yes,
front? He's been
I
on,
have.
he's, go
Yes,
ahead.
I have interviewed him there. Yes, an excellent scholar on the Civil War.
He's been on the podcast 3 times. He just wrote a book on Lincoln and immigration, which is superb. Very good. A lot of people think that history isn't as in vogue as it used to be. It's for history nerds, maybe like you and me. Do you find that to be true?
It's unfortunately the case. In the year 2000, the National Science Foundation developed a study which said that to catch up with China, our young kids need to have more education in science and math. And they came up with a wonderful acronym called STEM: science, technology, engineering, and math. And parents were concerned that their little boys and girls would not be able to compete with China somehow if they didn't have a science major in college or an engineering major in college. So you saw all of a sudden people going into those areas. And as a result, no one's majoring in history, relatively speaking. When I went to college, I graduated from Duke University in 1970. Around the United States, it was roughly 7 to 8% of college majors were history. Now it's down to less than 2%. At Harvard, for example, and most colleges that are very well known, the biggest major today is computer science. There's no college of any consequence that I can think of where the major is the most significant or the largest major is history. It just doesn't, people just don't think it's that relevant. Though I like to point out to people that the people usually running major companies in Wall Street or in many other areas are often social science majors. They're not STEM majors. So very often you get the ability to reason, to think, to write much better by being a history major or social science major. But I've been not probably listened to it that much on that position, on that point of view.
My graduate degree is in medieval history from Indiana University, and my kids marvel at the fact that I can pay the electric bill with such a quote unquote worthless major. But to your point, it's not, because of communication, because of writing, because of the ability to make an argument that has historical footprints or foundation. Has that helped you in your business, which has obviously been very successful?
I think so. But understanding the past and what happened before is important to understanding what's likely to happen in the future. The theory behind studying history is that you will understand what mistakes were made in the past, you can avoid them in the future, and what good things were done in the past, and maybe you can replicate or do them better in the future. That's the whole theory about why we study history. And I have spent the last 25 years or so educating myself more about history than I probably did in the previous part of my life. And now I find it one of the great pleasures of my life is reading history books.
You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is David M. Rubenstein. We're discussing his book, The Highest Calling: Conversations on the American Presidency. Do you have a favorite president?
I think there is one president who stands above all the rest, and that's Abraham Lincoln. When he was elected in 1860, the country was bitterly divided. And in fact, he got virtually no votes in the South. He wasn't even on the ballot in most southern states. And I think many people in the North, had they been elected president, would have said, if the South wants to secede, let them go away. We don't want them anyway. Lincoln didn't believe that. Lincoln said, we got to hold the Union together. And without Lincoln, I don't think the Union would have been held together. Without Lincoln, we would not have won the Civil War. And without Lincoln, I don't think the slaves would have been freed through the Emancipation Proclamation or later the 13th Amendment. I think Lincoln was by far the greatest president. He died tragically, obviously, in an assassination attempt that, interestingly, might have been avoided if one thing hadn't happened. As I pointed out in the book, and as others have noted before, Mrs. Lincoln was a difficult personality. And she had been at an event a couple of days earlier before the assassination where Julia Grant, Ulysses S. Grant's wife, had seen her yelling and screaming at somebody. And as a result, Mrs. Grant said, I don't want to be with her, when they were received an invitation from the president to go to see our American cousin in Ford's Theater on April the 14th. And as a result, the Grants did not show up at the invitation to go to the theater with the Lincolns. They decided to go to New Jersey, mostly because they wanted to avoid being with Mrs. Lincoln. And the result was that there was no military around Lincoln at the time. He had basically one guard with him, or one aide with him. But had Ulysses S. Grant been there, I think it's more likely than not that the military would have surrounded Lincoln, and John Wilkes Booth probably wouldn't have been there. But I guess you can't really know for sure how history is going to turn out. But I think he tragically died at the age of 56. And had he lived, I think Reconstruction would have worked much better.
And Grant forever kicked himself for not accepting the invitation, knowing that his personal guard could have saved or would have saved the president. And Mrs. Ord, I think it was the wife of Edward C. Ord, who Mary Lincoln was yelling at because she was particularly attractive and she was showing some attention to the president and she didn't like it. And it is one of those what ifs, great what ifs, actually. You, in this book, I have to say that there were several chapters that I found very compelling because of my lack of knowledge. And one of them is the chapter you have on James A. Garfield. Garfield's a little known president. He was a Civil War hero for sure. And he didn't serve very long. He was shot and killed. What made you include James Garfield? The historian is Candace Millard.
Right. Garfield, the story by Candace Millard is an interesting story. And that was one of the reasons why I included it. Garfield was president for only about 4 months. And for those who don't know, he was, many people say, maybe the most educated and talented intellectual who ever served as president. He had been a university president, a mathematician of great note. He had been a Civil War general, a great government leader as well, Speaker of the House of Representatives and so forth. He was elected president, and shortly after he was elected president, he was assassinated by a man who thought that Garfield should have given him a job as ambassador to France. But this assassination could have been prevented because the doctor who took over the control of Garfield's health and tried to heal him was really not a very good doctor. And as a result, he did things like take his unclean hands and finger and put it in the bullet hole to try to find the bullet. The problem with Garfield's assassination effort was that there were two bullets, one that was very damaging to him, and it was in his abdomen, and they couldn't find it to extract it. And they tried many different ways. And in fact, Alexander Graham Bell had an invention that would have enabled them to find it. But in fact, the doctor wouldn't let Alexander Graham Bell use his invention that to the fullest extent. So Garfield was a person who probably could have survived and probably going to be a great president. Remember, Ronald Reagan was assassinated the effort was made to assassinate him in March of his first year in office. And we now know that Reagan came very close to death. Had he had the doctors that Garfield had, he would have died. But we saw because Reagan survived, he was able to go on to lead a presidency that was of some note. Garfield probably would have done the same, but he just had terrible doctors.
Do we have any idea in terms of presidential historians how the ebb and flow comes to be with regard to the rankings? And I know they're subjective. They're somewhat predictable. Lincoln, Washington, Franklin Roosevelt, right. Teddy Roosevelt. But you have presidents who were well thought of, who are certainly on decline. The two most prominent would be Woodrow Wilson, I think, and Andrew Jackson. Please correct me if you think that's wrong. And you have presidents who 25, 30 years ago, or maybe when Arthur Schlesinger was running the show for the rankings, Dwight Eisenhower, Ulysses S. Grant, who are bubbling up in the rankings. What do you think of the whole business of presidential rankings?
It's fun. Everybody likes to see rankings. Everybody watches them, or reads them, even though they may disagree with them. And you're correct. Early on, Eisenhower was not considered a great president. Ulysses S. Grant was certainly not considered a great president. And I think today Eisenhower would be much more highly ranked as a president because he kept the peace. It was a very prosperous time in the country and so forth. And we did many things that didn't get a lot of attention, but he wasn't a dynamic figure. Early on, Jackson was considered one of our great Democratic presidents. And in fact, the Democrats used to hold Jefferson-Jackson Day dinners because they wanted to honor Jefferson and Jackson. But now we see Jackson as a bit of a racist, a man who plundered and did other things that were terrible to American Indians, and was not a man that we admire today, seen as a slave owner, among other things. Wilson, while he was once considered a great leader of the effort to make the world safe for democracy, today he's seen as a person who resegregated the federal workforce, and he was seen as a racist. He was a person who showed the racist movie in the White House and was somebody very unsympathetic to African Americans. So his standing has gone down. Plus, we now know that his wife basically ran the country more or less for the last year or so of his administration, because Wilson had suffered a stroke, was unable to really do much, and therefore his wife was really making decisions for him. So for that reason, as well as the resegregation of the workforce, his ratings have gone down. Jackson's have gone down. Eisenhower's have gone up. So ratings, they ebb and flow like ratings of anything. And I think it is interesting, as you note, that the ratings of some of the presidents have gone down dramatically, like Wilson and Jackson, and some have gone up fairly dramatically, like Eisenhower and also Truman. Truman left office very unpopular, and now he's considered one of our best presidents by many people.
A few months ago, we interviewed a presidential scholar who I'm going to guess, and he is Talmadge Boston, author of How the Best Did It, a book on presidential leadership. I don't know if you've ever talked to him.
Yes, I have.
One of the questions that I asked him is, among the great presidents and among the considered worst presidents or the failures, are there common threads through either their success or failures? In other words, did they get the big things right and they're considered great? Or did they get the big things wrong and they're considered failures?
Doing many things as a president involves doing things that are unpopular. And some of the best presidents were willing to take on unpopularity because they saw that what they wanted to do was the correct thing to do. And some presidents are more interested in being popular all the time, and they really didn't achieve all that much. Yes, I think it's what they have in common, the great presidents, is that they have a vision of where they want to go, and they're willing to pursue that vision. And even though their popularity may not be that great, Truman is a good example of that. He was not that popular at the time he was president, but today people think he did some dramatic things that were wonderful, and that now in hindsight they're seen as to be very impressive. My former boss, Jimmy Carter, for whom I worked in the White House, was very unpopular when he left the presidency. Now, 40 years later, his ex-presidency is considered to be very impressive, but even his presidency is being relooked at as having accomplished a lot more than people gave him credit for at the time.
Is John F. Kennedy an example of a president he served just 2.5 years, whose martyrdom certainly perhaps shades people's opinion of him, the public martyrdom, and his wife's reaction in just the day? I had Clint Hill on the podcast. Secret Service agent Clint Hill came on a couple of years ago and talked about it. But John F. Kennedy seemed to have gotten the big things right. And that's one of the reasons he's held in such high esteem. True or false on that statement?
He's held in high esteem because he was the young, handsome, dynamic president, martyred at the age of 46, president at the age of 43. His substantive accomplishments were not that great in just 1,000 days. Probably the most significant that we still live with is the way he handled the Cuban Missile Crisis and also the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which we still live with. But he had failures like the Bay of Pigs. He did not get his major civil rights legislation or his economic legislation through Congress. President Johnson did that, though, and President Kennedy gets some of the credit for what President Johnson did. But I think Lincoln is in the same situation, martyred at a relatively young age. He, in his case, I think 56, but he accomplished a great deal in his time in office. And I think when somebody young, right at the height of their powers, is killed, they do tend to have a higher standing in history, though I think Kennedy and Lincoln deserve their place in history, but being martyred obviously helps a bit.
May I ask, maybe put together, not a counter argument that's too strong, but an example which doesn't seem to fall into that, and that's William McKinley, 25th president, shot, killed right after serving as commander-in-chief for the Spanish-American War, which in and of itself is controversial. He was really at the height of his powers when he was killed, yet doesn't seem to make it into the top 10, the top dozen.
Yes, Karl Rove has written a very good book about him. McKinley was considered a bit of a machine politician and didn't have the kind of glamour and didn't have quite the star power appeal that Lincoln or a Kennedy did. Lincoln is considered as having been martyred for slavery or for fighting slavery, let's say, and for winning the Civil War, whereas McKinley wasn't killed for any cause that was quite as significant as that, let's say. And Kennedy had the young, dashing figure with a very attractive wife and a young family. And I think that was part of the allure towards the martyrdom.
Forgive me for asking, but where were you and do you remember when John F. Kennedy was assassinated?
It's an interesting phenomenon. The human brain tends to remember tragic things, where you were, what you were doing. I'm sure everybody remembers where they were on 9/11. And I remember exactly where I was in when Kennedy was assassinated. I was in the 10th grade English class, and the teacher came in and said the President Kennedy had been assassinated and everybody should go home, which we did for 4 days. So I'm sure, I don't know if you're young, you're not young enough to be there around when Kennedy was assassinated, but you no doubt remember where you were on 9/11, right?
And yes, and I can remember, I was born in 67. So I remember March 30th, 1981, when Reagan was shot. And we actually had Del Quentin Wilbur on the podcast, who wrote the terrific book about the day Reagan got shot, in details, as you said a few minutes ago, how close President Reagan came to dying. If he had gone to the White House instead of the hospital, he wouldn't have made it.
Yes, his Secret Service agent was Jerry Parr.
Mm-hmm.
Parr pushed him into the limousine, and they were heading back to the White House when he noticed that Reagan had some blood around his lips or his mouth, I think it was.
Mm-hmm.
And Parr said, "No, go to George Washington Hospital." Had they not done that, Reagan probably would not have survived. And even when he got to the hospital, even when he got there, it wasn't clear that they could save him because the bullet, they had a hard time finding the bullet. And at the time, they did a very good job of not telling people how serious his health was, but he came close to dying, as you now know, and that book pointed out.
Yeah, if the doctor hadn't rolled him over and seen the slit out of the back, you probably wouldn't, to your point, probably never would have been found.
That's correct.
We talked about what presidents do. Let me ask you, please, about what a particular president didn't do. We've had Mark Lawrence, Mark Updegrove, and Mark Silverstone on the podcast, three very prominent presidential historians of the 60s. And one of the main topics, as a matter of fact, we just interviewed Mark Silverstone a few weeks ago about his book. His book is The Kennedy Withdrawal, Camelot and the American Commitment to Vietnam. With regard to John F. Kennedy, do you believe something else that aids, helps, boosts his reputation is his decision to forego bigger involvement in Vietnam?
One of the great mysteries of presidential writing is what John Kennedy would have done with respect to Vietnam. Many of the people that wrote books about him were acolytes or people that had really admired him. And many of those people in the first couple of decades after he left office, or he was assassinated, I should say, would say that Kennedy always had said he was going to get out of Vietnam after the election, or Kennedy had told somebody secretly, I was going to get out of Vietnam. Historians today, I think, including the historian whose book I interviewed about Kennedy, Frederick Logoball, who's a professor at Harvard, just came out with a 2-volume on John Kennedy. Modern day historians, who I think are unbiased, do not see any evidence in written history or written documents that say that Kennedy was going to get out of Vietnam after the election. We just don't know that he would have. And remember, Kennedy's principal foreign policy advisors were the ones that Johnson kept. He kept them all, right, essentially. Dean Rusk was still there. Robert McNamara was still there for a long time. McGeorge Bundy was there as national security advisor. And his successor was Gene Rostow, and he was basically in the White House as well. So I think it's unlikely that Kennedy would have had the foresight to say the domino theory doesn't work. And the truth is, we can't afford the expenditures and the time. If he'd had that view, I think people who were favorable toward Kennedy would have produced more written evidence than they have to date. There just is no written evidence that Kennedy actually planned to get out of Vietnam after the election. I wish he would have, but there's no evidence that was really the case.
Well, as a thank you gift for appearing on the podcast, I'm happy to send you Professor Silverstone's book on Kennedy and Camelot in Vietnam. He breaks it down almost week by week, both not only from the American point of view, but what was going on in South Vietnam, what was going on in Congress, and how all these competing forces really, and I'm going to use this word because I think it's accurate, tortured Kennedy into not being sure exactly what to do. He didn't want another Korea. He didn't want another who lost China. But at the same time, there was no sense of faith in what was happening in South Vietnam, either at the grassroots level or in the leadership level, to think that a greater involvement would actually make a difference, as it turned out to be true.
We will never really know. As I pointed out earlier, many people that were big supporters of Kennedy always seemed to say that he would have gotten out because he was smarter than Johnson, or he had more experience in this area than Johnson, whatever the argument might be. But there just isn't any documentary evidence that others really accept that Kennedy was committed to getting out of Vietnam after the election. Now, maybe he wouldn't have gone at as high of the troop level as Johnson did. Johnson, I think, had at the peak, more than 500,000 American troops there. But I don't think Kennedy would have necessarily avoided all the problems that Johnson had. I wish he would have, but it's not clear that he could have been able to do so.
In your opinion, is there a president whose performance in office was so dismal that he is beyond reputation rehabilitation?
There are some people that are considered the worst presidents we've ever had. And of course, there's some presidents that didn't serve very long. One president died within 30 days after being inaugurated, supposedly because he spoke too long in the rain at his inauguration and got a cold. That may or may not be the reason he died, but he didn't really do very much. I think many people would say today, among historians, probably the least accomplished president would be James Buchanan. James Buchanan was a president who supported slavery and supported finding other ways to ensure that slavery would continue. When this South Carolina was succeeding, before Lincoln was actually inaugurated, Buchanan did nothing about it. And Buchanan more or less was sympathetic to a lot of what South Carolina was doing. And if Buchanan had stayed as president, he would have let the South secede.
He had the ultimate cop-out. I don't think they can succeed, but I don't think I can do anything about it if they do.
It's true. And he was our only non-married president. And interestingly, he had a niece named Harriet Lane. And Harriet Lane served as his hostess, in effect, and it was around her that the title First Lady was first developed. She was considered the First Lady. Interestingly, not a person who was married to the president.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends, LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, which is actually mentioned in Ted Widmer's book, Lincoln on the Verge, and the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn. Our guest today, David Rubenstein, author of The Highest Calling, Conversations on the American Presidency. Mr. Rubenstein, is there a Hoosier leader and or legend you particularly admire?
I would like to mention one, as you may or may not know. When I got involved in politics and government, the first person for whom I worked was a man named Birch Bayh. Birch Bayh from Shirkyville, Indiana, was running for president in 1976. I joined as his chief counsel of his Senate subcommittee, and I thought he was really qualified to be president. He had authored 3 constitutional amendments. He had, including the 25th Amendment, which is still very important, and including the amendment that gave 18-year-olds the right to vote. He also authored the ERA Amendment, which did not become law, but he was, I think, a pretty impressive person, a liberal from a conservative state. He balanced those, but he joined the race a little bit too late to probably have the impact that he wanted to have, and he dropped out after not doing well in Massachusetts in the primaries. But he was my Indiana connection, and his son as well. I got to know his son, Evan, reasonably well in recent years, and became a friend of his as well. So that's an Indiana connection. I should also point out that my daughter, Ellie, my second daughter, went to Indiana University to get her MBA, and a joint program with the programs she had at Purdue, and was spent a lot of time in Indiana.
May I send you, when the podcast is finished, as a thank you note, I recorded a podcast about 5 years ago with Louis Mahern and Nancy Pappas, and it's all about remembering Birch Bayh, who my mother absolutely revered. And I've met Evan Bayh on several occasions, and actually he was a guest on my podcast, a terrific guest, Senator Bayh was. And I had the opportunity to tell him, which was meaningful to me for sure, Senator Bayh, I remember my mother crying when your mother died.
His mother died of breast cancer at a very young age, I think 46 maybe.
Yes.
And I knew her a bit, and Marvella was an incredible wife of Birch Bayh, and Birch Bayh himself was just an engaging person, likable. I'm sure he had some enemies somewhere, but it's hard to see why, because such a likable person.
Much like Senator Richard Lugar, who was his compatriot in the Senate for a few years. And as a matter of fact, in September, we are There's a statue unveiling about Senator Lugar and his legacy. And part of it was how well he worked with the other side. I love asking this question of presidential historians. You get to choose. There's a new Mount Rushmore. Who are your four presidents?
If there was a new Mount Rushmore, only four presidents, I think you have to put Washington and Lincoln there for sure. They're already there, of course. The other two who are there now are Teddy Roosevelt and Jefferson. I'd have a hard time pushing one of them off. Honestly, Teddy Roosevelt did incredible things to re-energize the presidency. And I think Jefferson has his flaws. He was a slave owner, as Washington was. But the Declaration of Independence, expanding the country by twice the size through the Louisiana Purchase, I think deserves a lot of credit as well. If I were to have four people who are not on Mount Rushmore now, and there were going to be a new Mount Rushmore, who would that be? I think in hindsight, I would probably put up Harry Truman. I would probably put up, because he was the first African-American president, Barack Obama, because of historic things that he did. I probably would put up Eisenhower as well. And I'm biased. I obviously admire John Kennedy a great deal. Probably would put him up as well.
You would omit Ronald Reagan, much to my horror.
Reagan was a person who beat my former boss, Jimmy Carter, but I did admire many things that Reagan did. If I had five, I guess I would put up Reagan in the fifth position. And many people would probably say that Reagan was, post-World War II, one of the most consequential presidents because he redirected many of the things the country did.
Am I a bad person if I admire Richard Nixon and his presidency? You interview Evan Thomas for your book. I would love to have Evan Thomas on the podcast. His books are terrific. But there are some of us who think that Nixon was a pretty damn good president who had a serious character flaw that he couldn't control, and it manifested itself in nefarious ways. Do you admire Nixon in any way?
And some of the things that Nixon did, I do admire. For example, he came from very modest means. He got where he got by hard work and by the brilliance of his mind. And it was his strategic sense that enabled us to open up China to the Western world. It was he who really pushed that, I think, more than even Kissinger. Kissinger was involved, obviously, but it was Nixon's idea that he first articulated in an article before he was president for the Foreign Affairs magazine of the Council on Foreign Relations. Nixon would go down in history as one of our greatest presidents had he burned the tapes when they were first revealed. But for those who are too young to remember, he recorded conversations in his Oval Office, and when those tapes, the fact that he recorded them became known, Congress wanted them as part of an investigation into Watergate. But had he burned them on national security grounds before they were subpoenaed, I think he would have served out his second term and gone down history as a very significant president, in part because of his foreign policy accomplishments. But his domestic accomplishments were incredible, too. While he wasn't a great environmentalist by nature, the most significant environmental legislation occurred during his presidency. The EPA was created during his presidency, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. So he deserves a lot of credit, but I don't think historians will ever be able to overlook completely what happened at Watergate.
You are in the Oval Office in September 1974. President Gerald Ford asked you, Mr. Rubenstein, should I pardon Richard Nixon? Your reply is?
I would say it was a good thing to do, even though Gerald Ford probably lost the presidency over it. He lost the presidency to Jimmy Carter by a few votes, honestly, not that many votes, and he could have probably won the election without the pardon. That said, if it was up to me, and if the current presidential election were to go forward, and if the Democrats were to win, I would recommend to President Biden that he pardon Donald Trump. I think to get it out of the way and get all this behind us, I think would be a good thing for the country.
And you don't necessarily worry about, I can remember the pardon in 74, setting the precedent for one set of rules for the president and one for everyone else, or you just accept the premise, look, he's the president of the United States. He's obviously not like everyone else. We
have this concept that everybody's equal and everybody should be treated the same under the law, but we all recognize that the truth is everybody isn't always equal and there are extenuating circumstances. What's best for the country? I think the best thing for the country is to get these kind of problems behind us so the leaders of the country can focus on problems that are going to help solve the day-to-day problems of everyday Americans. In the case of Richard Nixon, I think having lawsuits and presidents being indicted, going to jail is not a good thing for our country. I think the same is true with Donald Trump. If he were not to win the election, I think it would be a similar gesture that would be welcomed by many people to get this all behind us.
You talked to historian Richard Norton Smith about Gerald Ford famously lost in 1976 to your boss, Jimmy Carter. You're right, a very close election, surprisingly, just two years after Watergate. I've always thought that Ford, tragic, it probably is not the best word to use, but perhaps another person who barely survived being killed twice in 1 month out in California. You think if Ford had won in 76, what would that have meant for things like the Reagan Revolution and supply side economics and many of the things that dominated the 80s?
Remember, if Ford had won in 76, it's unlikely he probably would have served another term. In other words, I'm not sure he would have run in 1980, and it was Reagan ran in 1980. Whether Ford would have supported Reagan, I doubt it, because they were really from different wings of the party. But you never can tell for sure. But let's assume for a moment that Reagan either was assassinated in March or that Ford ran for another term and he actually therefore eliminated the possibility that Reagan could run. Then we wouldn't have had the Reagan part of the Republican Party moving forward to the way it did. And the conservative part of the Republican Party probably would not have had a hero the way Reagan became. Ford was not, he was from the centrist wing of the party and was not the kind of hero to the right wing of the party that Reagan became.
What's it like to actually interview presidents? You interviewed Joe Biden for the book. President George W. Bush, I have to say, I laughed out loud at the quote he mentioned about his mother making fun of him during the marathon that he ran in. President Bill Clinton. What's that like? Most of us will never have that opportunity.
They're humans like anybody else, so they want to answer questions intelligently. They like to get good questions, but obviously you probably don't make jokes with them as much as you might with somebody else, or you don't have as much small talk unless you know them. I've actually known some of these presidents for quite some time, so it's not quite that intimidating to me to interview a president. Had I never interviewed a president, I did one for the first time, it'd probably be a little more intimidating. For this book, I interviewed Joe Biden in the Oval Office, just he and I, no staff or anybody, but I've known him for quite some time, and so it wasn't intimidating. I've known Donald Trump for quite a while, so it wasn't intimidating to interview him. So had I never interviewed these people before, of course, it's a little intimidating to interview a president of the United States, but you're an interviewer, so once you start to get past the first or second question, you're into the interview.
It's true, very true. I was intimidated to talk to Secret Service agent Clint Hill just because of his prominence on one particular day, and he could not have been a nicer man.
Yes, Clint Hill, as he's written about, suffered from the thought that maybe he could have done more to prevent the assassination from occurring. And he details in his book that he suffered some challenges that you no doubt brought out in your interview. It's a sad situation.
So you've sat down with Joe Biden, who's no longer running for president, and Donald Trump, who is still running for president. What are your thoughts on their personalities and their sense of leadership, like what they emphasize, how they make decisions? Because so much of the presidency is just, I'm going to decide to zig or zag, and that's the way it's going to be.
They are completely different in terms of their personality. Barack Obama, for whom Biden worked, likes to read memos and analyze the memos and give feedback that way, though he would have meetings with his advisors. Joe Biden probably would prefer to read the memo, but he won't make a decision based on the memo. He would prefer to have his core advisors around him, and he likes to have a lot of discussion and feedback. He's a kind of a blue-collar Democrat, hail fellow Met, likes to slap people on the back, likes to get the sense of people that he's dealing with, and a different kind of personality, but listens to people. Donald Trump is a unique figure in American politics. He'd never been in government before, the only person who's ever served as president who had no government experience at all, including military. He makes decisions not based on reading. He doesn't read very much in terms of memos and things like that. He makes decisions more or less on meetings or oral discussions with people, and he makes quick decisions, and he has a high regard for his decision-making ability, and therefore he then tends not to have as many advisors advising him as maybe a typical president like Joe Biden would.
Based on your conversations with historians and with presidents and people who almost were president, what What role does self-confidence play in making a president successful?
To be president of the United States, you need a certain degree of self-confidence, unless you got there a very unfortunate way. Somebody was assassinated, you didn't expect to be president. But generally, people get to the top of any organization, certainly the U.S. government, are fairly self-confident people. You sometimes get people who meander into the presidency and may not have the self-confidence that you normally would associate with that job. Calvin Coolidge was not a person who liked to brag about himself, and he didn't like to talk very much. But generally, in the modern era, when you get people who've been president, they have already gone to people and said, I am one of the most competent people to be president of the United States, qualified people to be president of the United States. That takes a certain skill set to be able to say, I am very qualified to be president. I want people to vote for me. And therefore, you get self-confidence. You don't get people who are shrinking from public discussion or people who are afraid to deal with other people, usually.
You're listening to Leaders and Legends. Today, we are speaking with presidential historian David M. Rubenstein about his book, The Highest Calling, Conversations on the American Presidency. I had a moment of potential heresy when discussing the presidency with historians of the 1960s. And I made the assertion, wouldn't it have just been better if Nixon had won in 60 and Kennedy had lost? Of course, they were mortified at such things. But I'll ask you, how much different would it have been better if Nixon had won in 60?
These so-called counterfactuals are hard to really know what would have happened. Had Nixon won, he would have probably continued the policies of Dwight Eisenhower in many ways, which were not that controversial. I believe that Kennedy, had he lost, I probably would not have been able to run for president again. But it's not impossible to say that he could have. Remember, Adlai Stevenson ran in 52 and lost, and ran again in 56 and lost. He was nominated twice. Kennedy was so young, maybe he could have come back again, and particularly if the loss was very narrow, as it would have been, most likely. Had Nixon won, I suspect he would have had a different team of people around him. He would have had people who had more experience in government. A lot of his top aides did not have experience in the federal government. John Ehrlichman and Bob Haldeman were not really government experienced people. So Nixon probably would have had more people who had been serving in the Eisenhower administration. So maybe he would have avoided the kind of problems that he got in the Watergate era. But who knows what would have happened? If Lincoln had lived, would Reconstruction have worked? Who knows? Maybe it would have.
Do you have a favorite movie about the presidency?
I'd say, I don't want to say it's a favorite movie, but the one that I remember the most is, aside from documentaries, and for plenty of very good documentaries, but the book on the movie that was made, All the President's Men, which is really about the Nixon Watergate situation that followed the book written by the same title by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. I think that was an interesting movie, well done, but obviously it's just a movie.
You mentioned a few minutes ago that you worked for Jimmy Carter. I remember that presidency, and actually went down to Plains one time with my very left of center mother to see what was going on there. You mentioned his presidency is being reevaluated. How would you undertake that task?
There have been several books written. My former boss, Stuart Eisenstadt, wrote an excellent book on the Carter presidency out about 2 years ago. And then there are several books, one by Jonathan Alter, one by Kai Bird. Kai Bird, I interviewed him for this book. They point out that Carter got a lot of legislation through, but today he's not considered a great president because he didn't get everything through. But today, very few presidents get very much of anything through. And Carter got a great deal of many bills through, but just wasn't as much as everything he wanted. In other words, Carter got many bills through, but he asked for so many more bills that people said he failed in many ways to getting all of his legislation through. But if you take a look at what he actually accomplished, it was pretty impressive. Now, he was president at the age of 52, and he left at 56, relatively inexperienced in Washington. He'd never really been in Washington before. So he was learning the ways of Washington, and he surrounded himself by a lot of Georgians who had really been in the state government with him. So he was inexperienced. He had a very good mind, but he thought he could understand everything, and he didn't care about politics at all. If you told him something was politically attractive, he would do the opposite. Mm-hmm. He was an unusual person, as we now know. He's been in hospice care for about 18 months. He's, I think, trying to get to the 100th birthday on October 1, and then I guess he would like to see a Democratic election in the next month.
Last question before we ask you the 5 questions we ask all of our guests. One of the best books I've ever read about presidential politics is called Camelot's End, the Democrats' last great civil war, about the 1980 primary fight between Edward Kennedy and Jimmy Carter. Do you have some memories of that? And to me, that is Jimmy Carter's, his victory in that primary is one of the most astounding accomplishments in the 20th century when it comes to presidents, because there was certainly 100 ways he could have lost that contest, and he won it handily.
What happened, for those who don't remember, is that Carter was pretty much staying in the White House trying to deal with a hostage situation. And because of that, he was reasonably popular for a while. But Ted Kennedy chose to challenge him, in part because Kennedy wanted to be president. He didn't think much of Carter, and he used the reason that Carter didn't want to support the health care program that Kennedy wanted, which wasn't going to pass anyway. But that was the reason. He was really running because he thought that he could beat Carter and he could win the presidency, in my view. Though I admire Ted Kennedy for many things, I think that in that case, I think it hurt the Democratic Party, because without a challenge to Carter could have gotten the nomination relatively easily, and probably more likely than not than a stronger candidate than he was in the general election. But he obviously might not have won, given how much he lost by. What people don't remember is that Carter was winning the primaries handily, and Kennedy was thinking of dropping out. He expected to lose the New York primary and to drop out. He had a concession speech already prepared, but then he won the New York primary, and then all of a sudden he continued and he won more and more primaries. But it became a very close primary election. Carter won barely. It was originally thought to be one that Carter would win handily. But Carter won in part because I think Kennedy was probably considered a little bit too liberal for some of the people in the Democratic Party, and Carter still was in control of the party apparatus a bit. But it was very close, and Carter did not ever get Kennedy to truly support him in the general election. And in hindsight, it probably didn't make much difference. But it was an incredible fight for the recapturing of Camelot. Many people who were Kennedy acolytes could not believe that Kennedy was going to lose to Carter, who was seen as a person who was not the true heir to the Kennedy legacy, and that Ted Kennedy really was a true heir and deserved to be president.
It's an example of where Jimmy Carter's political antenna sometimes get criticized because of his relationship with Congress. But when it comes to grassroots, get out the vote, primary rallies, meeting the people, Carter's in the very top rank, in my view.
Remember when Carter ran for the presidency initially, he didn't have very much money, so he stayed at people's homes. Can you see presidential candidates staying at people's homes these days? And then he would get up in the morning and make the bed and leave a thank you note for people. You can't imagine people doing that, but he just had no money. So that's what he did. And he had a very interesting technique, which I've always wondered about. If he would always write a thank you note to people right away. And when he did it, he would say, to Joe Blow, to Jane Doe. And he wouldn't say, Dear Jane or Dear Joe, because he maybe didn't know them well enough to be able to use the first name that way. But he did it in a way where nobody would be offended. It was writing like a memo form, to Joe Blow, to Jane Doe. And so it was written in a memo form, and therefore he didn't have to worry about whether he knew the person well enough to use them by their first name or not. And that's a technique I've sometimes used still.
You're always welcome to stay here, Mr. Rubenstein.
Okay, well, thank you.
Take it to Indianapolis. And it's also a political tactic employed faithfully and honestly by Mitch Daniels when he ran for governor of Indiana in 2004, staying in people's homes. And it makes a difference.
It does.
We've reached the point in the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Mr. David Rubenstein, author of The Highest Calling, Conversations on the American Presidency. Are you ready?
Go ahead.
What was your first job?
My first job was selling magazines door to door when I was 14 years old. I wasn't really good at it, but I sold a few magazines, so people probably didn't need the magazines.
Number 2, what was your first concert?
My first concert? Geez, I'm not sure. When I was at Duke University, I did go to a concert that Paul Simon and his then partner Art Garfunkel did when I was a teenager then, probably. Simon and Garfunkel, a very popular group then.
I meant to ask you when we were talking about Nixon, does Nixon's Duke law degree soften your opinion of him?
I have a good opinion. It's just not that probably as good as your opinion of him. But Duke wanted to have the presidential library of Richard Nixon, but the faculty opposed it. Sari Sanford, when he was president of Duke, wanted to do it, but he just couldn't overcome the opposition.
Number 3, if you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
I think I would recommend, if I could recommend any book at all, the number 1 book that I would recommend is The Highest Calling. But beyond that, probably the Bible. In that one book, if you're stranded on one island and you have no other books. The one book that probably has the most human knowledge in there and the greatest teachings is probably the Bible.
You and Vice President Mike Pence had the same answer.
Well,
Number 4.
Unusual, probably, but yes.
Number 4, if you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
Of course, my inauguration as President of the United States. I guess that would be fun. That would be one.
Will you hire me?
Sure, absolutely.
But if there's an event in history, if you could witness something that happened in the past, which one would you choose?
In any event in history, leaving aside religious kinds of things, probably the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the day that happened on July the 4th, or they didn't sign on July 4th, but they agreed to on July the 4th. That was something that really started our country, and we're about ready to celebrate the 250th anniversary of it.
Probably the most popular non-religious answer is that event. When it comes to religious answer, it's usually the resurrection, crucifixion,
yes,
or the Sermon on the Mount gets a lot of answers. Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record just to chat, whom would you choose?
I think having dinner with the Pope would be an interesting exercise. Try to get his mindset would be Vladimir Putin. Not that I admire him, but trying to understand what makes him tick would be quite interesting. Not many people have dinner with him. Having dinners with Elon Musk might be quite an interesting kind of thing. I think having a dinner with Warren Buffett, I've had lunch with him and I know him, but I think it's always a great thing to do that. I admire many other people, but I would say at any given time, whenever you can have a dinner one-on-one with the President of the United States, that's always great.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmond Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, and the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today, David Rubenstein, author of The Highest Calling, Conversations on the American Presidency. You may buy it on Amazon or at the bookstore of your choice. Mr. Rubenstein, thank you so very much for coming on the podcast.
The pleasure is all mine. You obviously have read the book and you know your presidential history quite well. So thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me.
That's very kind. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.